ladies and gentlemen. Please allow me to welcome you to MLI. Before we get our formal discussion underway, I am honored and pleased to be able to tell you that Elder Joe Macquarie is with us this morning to offer a traditional welcome and invocation for the success of our gathering and discussion. Joe Macquarie is Métis. She's lived in Ottawa since 1998. Currently, she is a Métis elder on the Ottawa Police Services Community Equity Council, a board member for Guignol Housing, and a member of Carleton University Elders Council. She's also a member of the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition as a representative of the Métis community. Elder Macquarie.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this morning. I live in the condo next door, so it was a short journey. My background is I'm a registered nurse with graduate studies in psychiatric nursing, so I'm able to, and I've worked in the North for more than 30 years as a nurse and mother, and I don't know which was more time-consuming. But I came to Ottawa, as he's just said, about 20 years ago to work with the Inuit. It was when I was in the North, most of my career was spent working with them and helping them develop their health services once the federal government had was devolving health services to the people themselves to run. And I helped them develop the board in the Keewatin region, which is I lived in Rankin for a couple of years doing that, and the other place was in Cambridge Bay. It didn't take me as long in Cambridge Bay because I finally knew what I was doing. My mandate was from the Department of Health was, well, just go up there and do what you think is best. So, anyway, as I said, I'm delighted to be with you this morning, and I would like to thank the Algonquin people for their hospitality as we meet on their land today. And also, I invite the Creator to be with us and the spirits of our ancestors to be with us and to guide our discussions. Creator, we thank you for bringing us together. We haven't seen each other for a while, but we realize that you've given us the gift of an opportunity to network and to chat with each other, and also to share our ideas. Help us to follow the teachings of our seven grandfathers, who so they're like the 10 Commandments, only there are only 7 of them, and they're a little easier to follow as guideposts as we traverse through life. Creator, we ask you to help us to respect each other and to treat each other with kindness. Help us to keep an open mind and to share generously our ideas. Give us the courage to speak up and to share those ideas, and give us the wisdom to know what we're talking about and how we're going to present it so that the ideas will be shared among each of us today, and therefore helping us to, I guess, look at life a little bit differently than we had when we had done so as we came in the door. I have to turn the page. The other gifts, Creator, that we thank you for are our honesty, and help us first of all to be honest with ourselves and honest with the people that we meet. Keep us humble, give us the gift of humility, and help us to speak the truth to ourselves, but also to each other. We thank you for being with us. We offer the prayers of tobacco, which I'll probably send this evening So if you see Creator smoke rising from the next door condo, you will know that we are praying for you. Miigwech. Are you helping me down? Okay, cool. Catch.
Just,
Some joys of being an elder.
just step down, we have you. Step down. There we go. There we go. I'll get that for you. Thank you, Elder Macquarie. Ladies and gentlemen, just, if I might, a quick word about MLI for those of you who may not be familiar with us before we get the rest of the day's proceedings underway. We're about to celebrate our 10th anniversary as the leading think tank in Ottawa focused on how federal power can be used intelligently and judiciously to advance the interests of Canadians. That's what we're here for. In those 10 years, we've been ranked as one of the top 3 new think tanks in the world. Our first book won the top international prize for think tank publications. We won the Prospect Award last year for top social policy think tank in North America. And last year as well, we were shortlisted for the top think tank project in the world for our biggest project, which we call Aboriginal Canada and the Natural Resource Economy. Ken Coates leads that project for us. And I want to say right away that I apologize for the bait and switch that sees me rather than Ken here at the podium. We'd promised that Ken would be leading today's discussion, and I'm very sorry to report that Ken's mother died a few days ago, and I know that you will join me and the rest of us at MLI in expressing to Ken all the sorrow that we feel at his loss. Just as importantly, I know that you will want to join me in saluting the leadership that Ken has given in matters of Indigenous rights, history, development, and reconciliation through his work at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. In fact, just 2 years ago, Ken won the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business Award for Excellence in Aboriginal Relations, and that was due to his work here at MLI. This event today is yet another manifestation of MLI's commitment not only to reconciliation with Aboriginal peoples, but with finding the means to break down the barriers that prevent Indigenous peoples from occupying the full place of honor and distinction that their contribution to Canada and the world entitles them to. Moreover, we are committed at the Institute to the proposition that Indigenous Canadians have long since ceased to be a problem or even a question. They are now an answer. They are now an answer, as I think today's discussion will underline with energy and with eloquence. We are just delighted to have so many prominent Indigenous leaders with us today, both on the stage and in the audience. We are in the midst of an impressive transformation that harkens back to the days of the fur trade and a long history of Indigenous collaboration with the resource economy. Remember what happened 50 years ago, the state of affairs 50 years ago, domination of Indigenous affairs by the Indian Affairs Department, almost no recognition of Indigenous rights, the 1969 white paper that proposed eliminating Indian status and Indian reserves. Indigenous people fought tenaciously for their rights and for legal and constitutional authority in accordance with those rights. Nothing was given to them. They spent millions on legal battles, and governments spent even more. It took a generation of leaders away from economic and community development, but they won major victories, including the 2004 duty to consult and accommodate decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, which we will hear more about from Dwight Newman, one of our senior fellows, shortly. The transformation which has taken place, which the Institute has been honored to be documenting, has been quite remarkable. Expanded employment, rapid business development, now equity investments in the development of Canada's natural resources, amongst many other things. Canada has, since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission reported, has been emphasizing the need for reconciliation. The resource sector, in our view, is the front line of reconciliation. It is not always a smooth or an easy process, as the pipeline debate shows, but the achievements are real and substantial. The ground has shifted, driven by Aboriginal or Indigenous communities, sustained by Indigenous business, shaped by the commitment, energy, and creativity of a large and growing group of Indigenous leaders who are determined to ensure Indigenous success. For the first time in 150 years, Indigenous peoples have a real chance to share in national prosperity. This is not an opportunity to be missed. We have to collectively embrace, support, and sustain reconciliation in the natural resource sector while still seeing that sector develop. There's no point in achieving reconciliation if the sector fails. We hope that today's discussion will help point the way to how we can reconcile those two terribly important things for Indigenous people and for Canada. If you want to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag Indigenous Opportunity. Our Twitter handle at the Institute is ML Institute. It's now my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium our keynote speaker for today's event, Stephen Buffalo. Stephen is President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada and a proud member of the Samson Cree Nation. He's been a terrific partner of MLI's as we have sought to tell Canadians and policymakers the incredible story of Indigenous engagement with the natural resource sector and the enormous importance of economic opportunity for Indigenous peoples in the broader reconciliation agenda. Stephen is going to speak for until about 10:30, 10:35. Then I'm going to introduce Sean Willey because Sean unfortunately has to catch a plane. And so I will turn things over to Stephen Buffalo. Stephen.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it. Welcome to Roadblock 101. No. Just kidding. Humanu tamtik. Minuhteen naskamana kapiks kristamaguya. Kape sage weden sigasun. Maskuchisik num sikopau chitnia. Tapwe miagiska mamuhtaimo soimantu. If you ever wanted to know what our Indigenous people felt like when signing treaty, that was kind of part of it. First of all, I'd like to thank the elder for the prayer. You know, I thank the Creator for today. It's and definitely nice to see all of you here coming to hear us and then to really talk about some of the issues. And you know, I'm from Samson Cree. My traditional name is Rising Sun, and the given name is Stephen Buffalo. But you know, when we talk about these things and we say it in our language, you know, we believe that our words have spirit. So even though I'm using the borrowed language of English, that spirit still continues, that it still remnants with you when you leave this place today. Again, I want to thank being in this traditional Algonquin territory. I would like to thank the opportunity from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, Brian, Allison, and our friend Ken. Our thoughts and prayers are with him now at this time. This is a gathering for the long-standing interest of Indigenous engagement in the natural resource economy. I'd like to acknowledge in attendance anyone from the private sector, anyone from government, and of course anyone from any other Indigenous groups. So let me begin my point. For generations, First Nations were barred from active engagement in the natural resource sector. Colonial systems, from the Indian Act and the creation of Indian reserves to deep patterns of discrimination, ensured that our prosperity that came from our traditional territories did not reach our communities. This is no longer the case. First Nations in the West favor careful, thoughtful development of oil and gas revenues and believe that we can and must be full partners in the economy, in our region and country. We will no longer be bystanders. We reject the culture of poverty and welfare dependency that Canada has kind of forced us into for many generations. As mentioned, currently I'm the President and CEO of the Indian Resource Council of Canada. It was established in the early 1980s. The IRC is an advocacy and lobbying organization that has grown to currently represent 130 First Nation members in Canada. We engage with all levels of government, resource organizations, private sector, companies on a regional and national level. We also work closely with Indian Oil and Gas Canada, a federal special operating agency that has the legal responsibility to manage and regulate oil and gas development on our lands. We've recently completed phase 1 of the modernization of the regulatory regime of the Indian Oil and Gas Act. And this development will help make our lands more attractive to industry. It may surprise some of you that we represent over 130 First Nations with oil and gas, primarily in the western provinces. These nations, those that have continuously produced over oil and gas over 70 years, and there's still a contingent of First Nations that have the potential to produce significant hydrocarbons in the future. So we support strong economic development initiatives like pipelines and are involved in large-scale Indigenous corporate partnerships and enjoyment of resource and environmental development, whether it be oil and gas, solar, wind, or other types of economic projects. You know, for the past decade, some of the First Nations, relatives and friends, particularly in British Columbia, have fought to prevent the construction of the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. You know, we understand their position and respect their protests, but we do not, as a group, share their position and approach. We are eager to see pipeline projects built and proceed, provided there are appropriate environmental protections and considerations. We believe we've come a long way in ensuring that these protections are in place and that they are getting better. The prosperity of First Nations depend on these projects going forward. The idea of economic development for First Nation is certainly not a new one. In the past, we developed our own strong economies and had extensive trading routes and commercial networks throughout the Americas. This occurred both and before and after the arrival of the non-Indigenous people to this continent. For thousands of years, we sustained ourselves with intimate knowledge of the land, the animals, and the ecosystem. Indigenous people forged important partnerships with the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company, which we all know was critical to the development of Canada. So the idea of economic development is not a new one to us. We've always been able to sustain ourselves, and we insist on the right to do so now. As Canada became more industrialized, with settlers began to populate the West in large numbers, our economies collapsed. In the case of my people, the Plains Cree, the cause of the destruction of the buffalo, an animal our entire lives and culture evolved around. At the same time, our traditional forms of government were displaced by Canada through various policies and legislation, including the colonial and oppressive Indian Act. Systematic discrimination still dominates political and policy-making spheres for us and stops Indigenous people from enjoying economic prosperity. We have to change these realities as we work towards rebuilding and strengthening our economies for First Nations. Today, we face what I see as major opportunities for our people. I'm pleased to offer my thoughts and participation of First Nations in various contemporary economic ventures such as the Trans Mountain and Northern Gateway pipeline projects, and what, in my view, constitutes proper environment for creation of and stimulation of economic development. As I said before, I'm a member of the Samson Cree Nation from Musquecheese. Samson Cree is an interesting economic case in itself. Large quantities of oil and gas were discovered on our lands in the late 1940s, and production began in the early 50s. The Bonnie Glen field in Alberta, situated on part of our territory, was considered a world-class oil and gas field. For over 60 years, oil and gas has been produced from this field. We received very significant royalties over this period of time. However, we had a small role in this exploration of this natural resource, but remained passive participants in this enormous economic venture. Although superficial meetings took place between ourselves, oil companies, and the federal government, we were never directly involved. Almost no job training or employment occurred for my people over a 50-year period. We had limited access to information. We were generally informed about decisions after they've been already been made about our assets by others. Basically, we received royalty checks and little else. You know, I use my First Nation as an example to illustrate the fact that First Nations will no longer accept a passive role in the development of the natural resources and assets. We will demand and only accept the role of a full partner. We are now becoming increasingly involved in the resource business development. We are full partners with many joint ventures currently. We also have forged good partnerships over the past 30 years with companies such as Suncor, Syncrude, and Shell Canada. Our continued involvement must include meaningful training, employment opportunities for our people. The acceptance of just a royalty check with no involvement, I'm very pleased to say, is something of the past for many First Nations. But I get it. Investors want as much certainty as possible. First Nations must put in place the proper environment in order to attract investment capital and to partner with the best progressive companies. To be sure, the obsolete Indian Act continues to be a large obstacle. However, First Nations and industry have found creative ways around these barriers and are enjoying success with their economic ventures. Investors also want and need political stability. As mentioned, our traditional systems of government were displaced by outside forces. Most First Nations are currently in various stages of rebuilding their governance capacities and economies. A number of recent studies, including the Harvard project, that demonstrated that First Nations with the most stable governments were the most successful in their economic development ventures. Let me give you an example. This year, RBC completed a $554 million bond issue to the Fort McKay and Mikisew Cree nations, the largest ever private investment by a First Nation. The funds permitted them to buy 49% stake in the Suncor Energy Oil Sands Storage Facility. The deal was oversubscribed. Clearly, the banks and industry want to do business with First Nations. So in my view, we are back in the game as major players. We are ready to take our rightful place in the Canadian prosperity. Canadians need to know that approximately 643 First Nations in Canada, we all have different cultures, traditions, languages, customs, territories, and histories. So we can't be looked at one monolithic block. You know, and the good thing and the funny thing is, as well, if you have brothers and sisters, you always don't agree with each other. You don't agree, and currently right now we don't agree with each other with pipelines and other issues. And First Nations are all at different stages of economic development and different interests based on their circumstances. It is in my view that First Nations are keen about developing their economies, creating jobs, lifting themselves out of poverty. Welfare dependency is going to be something of the past. Now, the importance of addressing the environmental concerns is critical to getting Indigenous people on board with a wide range of projects. We have a long tradition of protecting the environment for future generations. This will always be the cornerstone of our involvement in the resource economy. Rebuilding Indigenous economies that have been destroyed over the last 150 years is going to take some time. Changing the one-sided negative portrayal and stereotypes of Indigenous people will also take some time. Yes, we have been marginalized and forgotten, but there are a lot of signs of hope going forward. We must debunk the myth of Indigenous opposition to resource development. You know, an enormous amount of attention has been paid to First Nations on British Columbia coast who oppose the pipeline, or more accurately, the ocean shipping associated with getting those products to world markets. We definitely recognize and honor their commitment, even though if we don't share certain particular points of view. We have heard also a great deal from environmentalists, many who proudly declare that they are working on behalf of First Nations. And we also know who's funding them. These groups do not speak for us. We speak for ourselves. We definitely share the environmentalist concerns about the future of our planet, but wonder why they're so determined to undercut the few opportunities we have to enjoy the kind of economic prosperity that non-Indigenous people in this country take for granted. You know, the Fort McKay and Mikisew deal came under a lot of scrutiny. You know, the environmentalists had their say, and as well as some Indigenous groups. But on the other side, it was a celebration of economic development and prosperity. As most of you are aware, the majority of our people live in an impoverished community, suffer at higher rates of unemployment, health problems, social problems, and suicides. We definitely want to change this very quickly. Improving our economies through sound economic development is, I believe, the way to increase our standard of living to that of the non-Indigenous Canadian. There is ample evidence that First Nations are not automatically opposed to resource development. At last count, 51 First Nations communities have signed comprehensive mutual benefit agreements worth more than $400 million connected to the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. That is 41 agreements in BC and 10 in Alberta. And it includes every First Nation whose lands is crossed by pipeline and 80% of First Nations communities living near the pipeline's right-of-way. In other words, Indigenous communities closest to the project and have the most exposure to impact are on board. The similar number of agreements were signed by First Nation communities in relation to the Northern Gateway project. 30 of the 42 First Nations on the proposed pipeline right-of-way had signed agreements. You certainly wouldn't know this by reading the newspaper or surfing the internet. If pipeline expansion does not proceed, these agreements for First Nations will die, depriving their communities of mutually agreed upon benefits, including revenue-producing equity, jobs, training, education, skill enhancement, and more importantly, improved community service and infrastructure. The agreements also include procurement deals that affected First Nations so they can directly participate extensively in the economic benefits of this development. First Nations lost these opportunities with Northern Gateway project when the Government of Canada canceled it without consultation with us. The federal government has to do more responsive to First Nations who oppose the projects rather than the First Nations who support the resource development. It seems those Indigenous and environmental groups who oppose pipeline expansion really grab the headlines and get the government attention. How many Canadians, those in the business sector, really know about the work of the Indian Resource Council or about the First Nations LNG Alliance? How many know about the strong support shown by the majority of First Nations themselves for pipeline projects and resource development generally? That's the question. So like many Western Canadians, we too are upset about these delays and the potential death of these projects. Why don't we hear voices more fully represented in the media? Apparently I don't blockade roads and I don't stage sit-ins, but rather negotiate calmly, professionally for our communities to try to make a better future for our people. Clearly, Indigenous people, communities stand to lose a great deal if resource development is stopped in its tracks. We also heard a great deal about the legal duty to consult with Indigenous people as set out by the Supreme Court of Canada. The consultative process is an important one for government, industry, and First Nations, and it must include pro-business First Nations such as the ones we represent. The federal government has to do this properly, and currently they've made a mess out of what's happening with the Trans Mountain expansion project. Consultation has to be real. It has to be robust, and it has to be meaningful. But this does not mean every Indigenous community will get everything they want out of the deal. We understand and respect the authority of governments associated with the duty to consult and accommodate. However, we have a right to be heard. We have a right to be part of the solution to the challenges facing Canadian resource developers. This process works. Our communities are currently partners with hundreds of oil and gas transmission companies that crisscross this country. Our resource-active communities are gaining autonomy from Government of Canada and can attract and be a progressive part of this country's economic future. So please, do not hold Indigenous people to a double standard, as Canadians often done. Some First Nations oppose oil and gas development, and others do not, just like some other Canadians. Some have legitimate concerns for our environment that definitely have to be addressed. After all, the opposition by the City of Montreal and other urban areas, not Indigenous groups, helped kill the Energy East pipeline project. But let's build a foundation for a different future where Indigenous people are seen from the outset as full partners in a new development process, rather than a barrier or a hurdle. This past template doesn't work, so working together would be the best for the future. Indigenous people are sick and tired of being seen as a problem for Canada. We understand that Canada's prosperity can and should be good for Indigenous people. However, the Canadians need to appreciate that our prosperity is good for Canada too. We've already seen many success stories in the resource sector and in many other areas in the Canadian economy. You know, we've waited for generations for a chance to be treated as full economic partners. Now we have the political and legal authority to ensure our intentions and interests are met. Resource development is the new fur trade. We can rebuild partnerships and cooperations that provide an economic foundation for Canada. The Trans Mountain and other pipeline controversies show how important that Indigenous people, the Government of Canada, and all Canadians get this right to move forward. The organization I represent will continue to speak out in support of the oil and gas industry, pipelines, and alternative energy and other infrastructure that are a benefit to our Indigenous people. It is for that reason that we want Trans Mountain to be built as soon as possible and the federal government to stop adding barriers, such as the Bill C-69, to help build this country together. Hi, and Naskaman, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Normally I'd say a couple of words about Stephen's presentation, but I know that Sean is under terrible time pressure, so I'm going to go immediately to Sean. Sean is the president and CEO of Desnethe Development. Sean has roots in the Nisquelan and Métis communities. He grew up in a mining household. He experienced life in communities from the Northwest Territories to Nunavut to Alberta to Saskatchewan. In his role as Director of Corporate Responsibility at Cameco, Sean developed the strategies and led all negotiations which saw Cameco build upon its successful track record with Indigenous peoples. Sean also serves as co-chair of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, chair of the highly successful training partnership Northern Career Quest, and he's the director of the Global Indigenous Trust. Sean.
Hello, and I apologize I have to run. I have a 6-year-old Christmas concert, and I like all you people, but my daughter comes first when they travel as much as we do. I respect the elder for her words this morning and pay homage that I'm speaking on the Algonquin traditional territory. As Brian mentioned, I'm the past chair of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, so they don't come back at me. I'm the CEO of Desnethe Development Corporation, and Desnethe Development Corporation is one of the most progressive First Nations entities in the country. It was started 30 years ago. It's wholly owned by the English River First Nation. The English River First Nation is located 600 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon. There's not much farming 600 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon. There's a bit of logging, but what the community saw in the late 70s and early 80s was the commodity uranium, and a very highly contentious commodity. And the community didn't sit on the rights that they knew they held. They believe their rights are inherent. They believe their rights are natural. Their rights aren't taken away by engaging with non-Indigenous entities. And they realized that this was our opportunity to move forward. And so, I want to talk for about 10 minutes, but I just want to talk about the value that Indigenous economic development brings to this country. And it's the learnings I've learned in the Northwest Territories working for the mining industry and building some of the most Indigenous inclusive programs in the country. I mentioned this morning to the Senator, and recognized Senator Dan Christmas, we share this viewpoint that Indigenous business isn't about rights. At some point, you have the rights and you have the opportunities. You still have to have the wherewithal and the work ethic to go and tackle that opportunity. So English River saw the world's largest, highest grade uranium deposits. And in today's context, the environmentalists might have come in and stopped those. But these uranium deposits set the standard for Indigenous inclusion across the country. Because the model, our community said, we want to be part of the environmental process going forward. We want to be part of the ongoing monitoring of these mines as long as they last. And we want to be part of the decommissioning and reclamation. If that's satisfied, we want to participate in the business opportunities. Because the fact about Indigenous economic development is that our communities want own source revenue. And so a lot of people say, well, why do you want own source revenue? There's not one culture in this world that has moved forward up the socioeconomic run for self-determination on government funding or aid from other people. You have to create your own source of revenue. Secondly, they want, part of my mandate is not only to create wealth, but employ as many people as possible in our community. So our community is about 1,200 people large, majority of them working for the nuclear industry. We've lost about 150 jobs with the uranium mine slowdown after the 40-foot wave hit the nuclear power plant in Japan almost 8 years ago. The market's softened. Those 150 people are craving work. They're not going back on social assistance. I had 10 of them actually come out to Goderich, Ontario to work at the salt mine while I was on a labor dispute. So it changes the context of Indigenous employment. Well, I have a lot of non-Indigenous friends who say, why don't Indigenous people just go to work? And that's one of the biggest drivers and the biggest value for Indigenous economic development. Does Nethe, we have a portfolio of companies, we hire traditionally 60 to 65% Indigenous people. Indigenous companies are the best at hiring Indigenous employees. And why is that important? It's because that breaks the cycle. So my mother, a Dene woman from Northwest Territories, was one of the first women in the Bank of Montreal's Aboriginal banking program. So when I was young, my mom was always going to school, was always going to work. So from the time I was 2 and 3 years old, that was ingrained in my thing that my mom went away somewhere. My kids now 6 and 3 have that same frame of reference. When you're on the reservation and you're under social assistance and your parents aren't going to work anywhere, that's your frame. So I always champion these leaders in our community who break that cycle of social assistance and get into the wage-based economy. And what happens in the wage-based economy, we all want to do better than our parents, and we keep generating wealth. And so you have examples in northern Saskatchewan and northern Alberta about that first generation who broke that cycle. And they were laborers, they were heavy equipment operators, they were at the low end of the scale. Their kids now go back and they get a trade ticket, and they come back to work, and now they're tradespeople, they're in the professional ranks. Their kids now, you have examples of now their kids are coming back in management and they're university educated. So it's a multiplier effect. The second point about hiring Indigenous people, we don't run to the bank and store all our money. Trust me, we wish we did. We spend money and we go out and we buy new vehicles and trucks to close that socioeconomic gap. So the study we've done in northern Saskatchewan was $1 that the uranium industry spent created another $3. When they hired an Indigenous employee, another $3 came out because you're rotating that money. There's a multiplier effect. The Ford dealerships hiring new people, the furniture stores hiring new people. The value of the Indigenous economy right now is growing at 8% per year versus the GDP where we're hovering around 2%. Indigenous, as Stephen put out, Indigenous people, we want the opportunities, right? And what I worry about with legislation that stops the opportunities happen is economic development organizations such as ours never create. There's a number of First Nations out in this neck of the woods that don't see the value of creating an Indigenous Economic Development Corporation like we have, like Fort McKay has, like the Clecho Nation, Northwest Territories have, like the Tawasin have in Vancouver. because they don't see the opportunity. And I think we need to do a better job of making sure those opportunities are open to all people. We've been talking with the federal government, again, on the value of Indigenous procurements. And these mining companies and the oil companies, if it wasn't for the resource companies, Indigenous business would be nowhere. The telecommunications companies are not working with us. The banking industries are finally turning around and lending us money. The automotive industry's never worked with Indigenous people. The transportation industry's never worked with Indigenous people. So if it wasn't for the resource companies, where would Indigenous business be? So we're pushing the federal government to say, well, open up your procurement channels. You guys spend on average $16 billion through procurement a year. How much do you spend on Indigenous business? The number is 0.3%. Whereas the uranium mines, the Fort McMurray area and the diamond mines in Northwest Territories have spent over $12 billion in the last 20 years. So obviously they have the same risk that the federal government has. But you as a taxpayer, when I'm bidding on a job and I lose that job by $50,000 to a non-Indigenous entity, but I'm hiring 50% Indigenous employment, and half of those are on social assistance, the better value for the taxpayer is to work with Indigenous companies. So we've been working with the federal government modernizing their procurement channel to open up even more opportunities. Lastly, I'll just leave you with this. I was over visiting the Sami 2 weeks ago. They want the Canadian rights system. As Indigenous people, they like the strength of the Indigenous rights. And we were asking, well, why do you want Indigenous rights? And they said, well, we want to create business. And I said, okay, you've gotten mixed up in the rhetoric that comes out of our media and out of our governments in Canada, because creating a business is not about rights. Creating a business is about those entrepreneurial skills, looking at the opportunity and going after it. And that's what our elders have taught us. Go out and create business, because the more you do better and the more you're out talking about our culture, that's how we're going to keep our culture alive. We're not going to be seen as the culture of poverty that has overtaken our culture today. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I have to run.
Sean and I were just saying that's the way to do it. Walk out on a high note. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we go to the next piece of our official program, let me just acknowledge some of the many important, prominent members of our Parliament who are here with us. Senator Dan Christmas is here, and Dan will, at the end of our event, say a couple of words. Colin Carey, Alex Nuttall, Arnold Viersen, all from Parliament, from the House of Commons are here, and Senator Galvezi is, I believe, coming a little later to join us. So welcome to all of those important policymakers, and we're grateful for your attendance, and we hope that you will take the messages that you hear today back to your colleagues in Parliament. Now, with your permission, I'm going to direct your attention to the screen that we have by the stage here. We're very fortunate at MLI to have as a Monk Senior Fellow, one of our most senior collaborators, Dwight Newman. Dwight's a former Rhodes Scholar. He's one of Canada's foremost scholars of constitutional law, and particularly Indigenous rights as they relate to the development of natural resources on traditional Indigenous territories. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible for Dwight to be with us in person, but what we were able to do was to organize a conversation between Ken Coates and Dwight, our project leader on these issues. And together in this video, they're going to help set the scene for some of the rest of our discussion with a talk about the path of Indigenous legal rights that has brought us to where we are today. I will mention, by the way, that the full conversation is about a half hour long. We have edited it down for today's event to about 16 minutes, but we will be posting the full video online on our website, so anybody who would like to learn more, I would direct you there. So could I please ask the technical wizards in our midst to see if you can fire up this video? I'll do my best. Thank you, Brett.
We're here with Dwight Newman. who is one of Canada's leading scholars of Indigenous rights in the natural resource sector. He's a Canada Research Chair in the College of Law at the University of Saskatchewan, and his research chair specializes in Indigenous rights, looking at both the constitutional and the international sort of aspects of that. Dwight, is delighted to have you with us here at this session, and we're sorry you can't be there in person, but there's many people gathered in Ottawa to debate this very important this discussion about the future of Indigenous participation in the natural resource economy. So I've got a series of questions I'd like you answered and address for us. The first one is, how have Supreme Court decisions over the last 20 years changed Indigenous involvement in the natural resource economy?
Okay, and I'm very glad to be part of this discussion, and sorry that I can't be there in Ottawa in person. In terms of this question of how Supreme Court of Canada decisions have changed the Indigenous role in the natural resource economy over the last 20 years, I think there are a lot of different things that we could say. On the one hand, I think there have been a number of clarifications on substantive rights held by Indigenous communities, but also a lot of uncertainties that have been left or ways in which those rights haven't been expanded, particularly in relation to natural resources. At the same time, there have been a number of procedural rights established that have taken on much more significance than it might first have been realized that they would have. And there I'm talking particularly about the duty to consult doctrine. And so I could talk about those two aspects a little bit. In terms of the substantive rights, so rights held under Section 35, we would go back just over 20 years to the mid-1990s, to a period where there were a lot of clarifications or attempts at clarifications from the court. The Vanderpeet decision in 1996 saw the court develop a test for Aboriginal rights under Section 35. As it's turned out, that test has not been very good in terms of any kind of commercial rights for Aboriginal communities in terms of the court's later interpretations and applications of it. They developed an Aboriginal title test in Delgamuukw in 1997, where they applied Vanderpeet but adapted it to the title context. And then, of course, there have been later cases on title, and most significantly the Silcotin decision in 2014. And there certainly are some land rights established for communities that are in parts of the country where there had not been treaties reached. But there have been a lot of ambiguities left in the decision about the exact scope of resource rights associated with title. And so I actually think that these various decisions on the substantive rights side haven't done all that much to offer clarifications in the ways that might have been hoped. In some ways, the court is trying to leave a lot of room for negotiations and for finding a path forward together. And that's where the duty to consult doctrine comes in. The duty to consult doctrine developed especially since 2004 in a new form in the Haida Nation decision, and then with various other later decisions speaking about it in various ways. In some ways looks like this procedural right that where the Crown might have effects on an Indigenous community's rights, that there needs to be a consultation about that potential effect. In practical terms, that doctrine has had a lot of effects in terms of the Indigenous role in the natural resource economy. Companies seeking to engage in resource development in areas within the traditional territories of Indigenous communities want to engage early with those Indigenous communities, and in many cases actually will enter into negotiations directly with the Indigenous communities rather than leave things up to governments under this doctrine that the court had developed. And the doctrine has thus really leveraged a role for Indigenous communities and really helped support a lot of the development around impact benefit agreements and other types of Indigenous industry agreements that are really contributing to a prominent role for Indigenous communities in the natural resource economy.
Excellent. It's really helpful to sort of frame out how these legal sort of decisions have shaped something very important over time in Canada and made a huge impact, I think, on Indigenous participation. So perhaps to be a bit more precise, in a practical and legal sense, how much authority have these different Supreme Court of Canada rulings given Indigenous people over the natural resource economy? Do they really have effect? Are they really giving power to Indigenous communities?
So if we're thinking about how much authority these decisions have given to Indigenous communities or recognized in Indigenous communities over the natural resource economy, I would say we need to differentiate between the legal authority and the practical authority. And the legal authority under these decisions is actually more limited than is often portrayed. So the duty to consult doctrine, you get the courts repeatedly stating this is not a veto power of any sort. And in fact, they say governments could proceed with consultation and make a decision contrary to the wishes of Indigenous communities. Under the legal doctrine, the legal rights are actually surprisingly limited in some ways, at least so far as recognized by the court to date. But the practical side is very different. And companies don't want things wound up in legal disputes. That's not good for companies. It's not good for Indigenous communities. And so there are actually practical ways where there can be a movement forward, and there can be a lot more practical authority by Indigenous communities, either under rights that the courts haven't recognized as yet, or simply under the application of the existing rights that have been recognized, but in ways that on a pure legal scale wouldn't necessarily give as much authority as there might be on the practical side. And so the duty to consult doctrine is again an example where in pure legal terms, governments could end up fulfilling this without changing all that much about what they're doing, but that gives rise to disputes if that's the route forward. And so it's actually much better for industry and Indigenous communities to find win-win agreements and to find paths forward that avoid legal disputes. And so in practical terms, the Indigenous community has a chance to engage with industry under this doctrine that the court has offered. So
you've described, Dwight, a very fluid situation. We always look to the law for precision. We want to know exactly what it means, exactly what power is there. You've just described a situation where there's an awful lot of flexibility and nuance, and that practicalities can be as important as the actual legal sort of aspects. So to look forward a little bit, what are the major legal questions in terms of Indigenous rights that remain outstanding in the area of natural resource development? And of these issues, which ones are likely to be litigated in the coming years?
Okay, so if we're talking about the issues that remain outstanding, the legal issues that could be litigated in the coming years, I'm actually going to say I don't think very many will be litigated in the coming years. I think some might be litigated in the coming decades, and that's not really fast enough for Indigenous communities that are seeking to deal with practical problems right now. Many of the cases in terms of the litigation effort involved are enormously lengthy proceedings. The Silcotin decision on Aboriginal title at the Supreme Court of Canada took years to get there, and at trial it involved 360 trial days, which is a massive investment in terms of the legal cost and in terms of the time to get it on through litigation. I do think that there are a lot of outstanding legal issues on Aboriginal title that could end up getting litigated. I've actually heard some Crown lawyers say that they think there are another 30 or 40 cases to define the various different parameters of Aboriginal title, and I don't see that as very helpful to anyone to have 30 or 40 major Aboriginal title cases litigated. I don't think we'll see it in the next few years. We might see it in the next few decades, but there are uncertainties, and they could be litigated. In treaty areas, there are major differences around the interpretation, for example, of the historic treaties on resource issues. In a number of the numbered treaties, there are these issues on was there an agreement to share the land in full? Was there an agreement to share land to the depth of a plow? these types of underlying legal issues, they could be litigated, but then one party is going to win and one party is going to lose, and there may actually be win-win routes forward that get negotiated instead rather than this being litigated. And so I don't see it being litigated in the next few years. If there aren't negotiated solutions found, maybe it will be litigated rather in the next few decades. And again, it's not fast enough for anyone given the urgency of a lot of the issues involved. We could see litigation around the significance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and some of that litigation will happen if Bill C-262 is passed through the Senate, which is a bill on UNDRIP implementation. In fact, I've heard lawyers at industry conferences talking about the large number of litigated issues that they foresee under this act if that moves forward. Whether that moves forward or not, I think there will be some litigation around the significance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's already being brought up in a lot of the cases, and there are arguments on does that change the duty to consult into free, prior, and informed consent, things like that. There will be ongoing discussions on and possible litigation on, but again, I'm not sure it will happen in the next few years. It might happen over the next few decades, but there may be ways to negotiate and head off the need to litigate over things and to find more constructive paths forward. So those would be some of the types of things that might be litigated. There are a lot of other types of questions around Section 35 Aboriginal rights that could be litigated, but again, if they're negotiated in a more constructive way, that may be better for everyone.
So Dwight, you mentioned the Chilcotin decision and the fact that it took a long time and obviously cost a lot of money. Can you give us a bit of a sense of the time frames you're talking about? Like how long did the Chilcotin decision take from when the Chilcotin folks first brought it in to when it was actually resolved? Secondly, how much did it cost to actually for all the participants in it, if you know? And did it have an effect? I remember in 2014 when Chilcotin came in, the first ever recognition of Indigenous ownership of traditional lands in a very dramatic way. People are talking about this as revolutionary. It's 4 years on. Has the revolution started, or is it already over?
Okay, so in terms of the costs, time-wise and financially of the Chilcotin decision and the effects of the Chilcotin decision, there are a lot of different things that we could say there. I think in terms of the timelines, we could actually say that the underlying disputes were actually from decades prior to when it reached the Supreme Court of Canada. Now, there were some attempts to negotiate that were unsuccessful, and so I've just talked about negotiation could be a constructive path forward. If it's not, then there might be litigation decades down the road. But even from when the litigation was commenced to when it actually reached a final decision at the Supreme Court of Canada, we're actually talking about over a decade there, or around a decade there. Now, there were some attempts along the way to negotiate based on some of the decisions on the way up, but still a very significant length of time there. And it's very difficult to get a major case from the beginnings of trial to a Supreme Court of Canada decision in under about 5 years for these types of cases at the fastest. And that's a long time to be in litigation. Now, on Aboriginal title, the standards of proof that the Supreme Court of Canada has set out are complicated. They're challenging to meet. So the case involved 360 or so trial days. Each of those trial days, you have a lot of lawyers sitting there. A lot of lawyers have spent a lot of time preparing for each of those trial days. So the estimates that I've seen are that on the Indigenous side, the litigation costs were in the range of $20 or $30 million. On the government side, one would probably put on at least the same kind of estimate. Now, how you calculate that becomes a little different because it's justice lawyers more so than private lawyers. But if you attributed the full cost to it, we're talking about litigation that's costing $50 million plus to resolve that particular case. what's come of it. At the time in 2014, it was treated by some as a game changer. In some ways it is. I mean, it sets a very significant legal precedent and says some very significant things about title, although because it involved a change from prior things the Supreme Court of Canada had said, we actually don't know if the Supreme Court would say the same things the next time a title case would come to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of real challenges around instability and the way the court has engaged with precedent in this area. But set that aside, has the case had practical effects? Yes, in the sense that it's led to the recognition of a particular area of land under Chilcotin title, but there are a lot of lingering issues around what that's meant. And there's been some ongoing negotiation around other areas of land. But did it get $50 million of issues sorted out? Or would there need to be more spent to sort out some of these things? I mean, there are a lot of complicated questions to ask in terms of the costs and benefits of litigation as opposed to other ways of finding constructive solutions.
Very, very interesting. So from your legal perspective, and you've got a remarkable national and international view on sort of what's happened in terms of Indigenous rights. I know you spent time in Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States looking at these kinds of issues. How do you see Indigenous engagement in the natural resource economy changing in the next 10 to 20 years? As you sort of go from here going forward, I asked you before about going backwards the last 20 years, we've seen a huge change. Are we going to see, have we reached a status quo? Are we just going to go along the same path? Or do you see these legal rights changing Indigenous participation in the resource economy dramatically?
So in thinking about what we might see in the years ahead in terms of Indigenous participation in the natural resource economy, I think we will see some very different things than we've been seeing before. And frankly, some of the developments actually arise out of negotiation rather than out of the litigated cases. I would say one of the biggest changes in Canada and one of the most under-discussed changes in Canada is the successful negotiation of modern treaties across large parts, particularly of northern Canada, some other parts of British Columbia, in some smaller areas there. But we have some communities that are really positioned for some transformative changes in the years ahead in terms of their position on participation in the resource economy. The development of a new territory in Nunavut, there's some really interesting potential there as well. And a bit of a different way than in some of the modern treaty areas that have been negotiated. But I think one of the things we'll see both in some of those areas, but also in the context of some communities that have moved forward successfully in some of their negotiations with industry already and have thus acquired more of a capital base already, is I think we're going to see some communities engage in Indigenous-led development that's a very different kind of phenomenon than we've seen before. Some communities are positioning themselves very successfully to lead up resource development projects or resource transportation projects, and I think that's transformative for Canada in some ways, and a very important development that we're seeing. But I think the other thing that we're going to see is huge disparity between different communities, depending whether they've positioned themselves to participate in the natural resource economy or other sources of economic growth, or whether they've not. And that's going to present some real policy challenges in terms of inequalities between different Indigenous communities. And we already have that to some extent. I mean, we have Indigenous communities in Canada where the average family income is $200,000, well above the Canadian average, in some very successful communities that have done some positive things, that have had good leadership, and that have taken these steps forward in terms of economic growth. And we also have large numbers of Indigenous communities in Canada where the average family income is under $20,000, and we have some desperate poverty challenges. And this is going to present some really significant issues in the years ahead. At the international level, I think we might see some of the same kind of thing. In some places, we're going to see Indigenous-led development, Indigenous-supported development. In other places, we're going to see that not occurring, and we're going to see some real disparities between the situation of different communities that arises, and that presents some policy challenges in the years ahead as well. In terms of other changes that we might see, I'd just say a lot of this depends on a lot of different developments, and less probably hinges on the law than on efforts of communities, and maybe smaller and less exciting legal changes, but legal reforms to facilitate an economic environment for communities, more so than the big constitutional changes, or more so than big legal transformations around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but very practical changes to facilitate Indigenous business, to facilitate Indigenous economic growth for communities that want to pursue that at very granular levels of legal reform. I think that may actually be the place where we see the law developing, but a lot of that's going to be through hard work as between governments and Indigenous communities to find practical ways forward, oriented to opening opportunities for economic growth while respecting different cultural values. And I think that's one of the under-discussed areas where law matters, is in these very tangible spots where that can open up opportunities.
Dwight, that's very excellent, very helpful. One last really quick question. How does Canada sit in terms of its Indigenous relationship with the natural resource economy relative to other Indigenous populations around the world? Are we lagging behind the best case scenarios? Are we leading the country, leading internationally in terms of these both legal and practical parameters? How's Canada doing?
Well, that's a complicated question to answer, because there's always room, certainly, for Canada to do better than it's doing. And there are things in Canada that very rightly deserve critique and criticism. But Canada is doing a lot of very positive things, and on a lot of fronts is actually a leader in terms of the engagement of Indigenous communities in new opportunities. There are things we can continue to learn from other countries that are doing some good things, but Canada is doing a lot of good things. We shouldn't forget that, even at the same time that we continue to offer critique and continue to seek improvements to what's going on in Canada at the same time.
Great, thank you very much, Dwight. You're very helpful. You took a very complicated area of study and sort of made it very easy to understand and comprehend. It'll fit in very nicely with the rest of the conversations we're having today here in Ottawa, so I appreciate that very much. Dwight Newman is a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Rights at the College of Law, the University of Saskatchewan. He's also a Monk Senior Fellow with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you again, Dwight, very much.
Thank you.
Those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting Dwight personally, I want to reassure you that normally when he speaks, the words come out at the same time. I'd like to invite the panelists, if I could, to come up on the stage. Just knock those tent cards off. Don't worry about those. I'm now going to ask the third panelist, from whom we have not yet heard, Teresa Tate-Day, to give us a few comments. Teresa is a founding member of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, about which you will be hearing a lot, not only today but in the future. Teresa's Wet'suwet'en hereditary name is Wehelite. Close, pretty good. Meaning far seer, far seer. She's a graduate of the UBC Sauder School of Business in Aboriginal Business Management. She's president of the Wet'suwet'en Matrilineal Coalition. She served on the Equality Rights Panel of the Court Challenges Program of Canada and is former Director of Native Programs of the Legal Services Society of British Columbia. Teresa, I wonder if you would like to make a few comments to the
Yes, I
group.
would. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you,
take
ladies
your
and
time.
gentlemen.
Take your time.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity. Thank you, Elder, for the wonderful prayer this morning. It really does exemplify who we are as Indigenous people. And to the Algonquin people, the people of this place we're called Ottawa, it's really here that the history began. When King George III came here in 1763 and recognized sovereignty for Indigenous people. And it's this recognition of sovereignty that really led the court cases to go forward over the years. And when the British North America Act was during Confederation, Indigenous people through Confederation really were seen as a problem rather than a solution that we see Indigenous people here today. The interpretation of the Royal Proclamation through the eyes of non-Indigenous people set the stage for that next 150 years, where Indian people were subjected to an Indian Act, were put on the reserve. And the only way that Indigenous people could really associate with Canadians at that time was through that process. And the reason why that happened was because they wanted land. People came here to get land, free land. It was advertised in different parts of Europe and so forth. And so the only way that we could go forward was through consent. And a lot of these court challenges came as a result of working with Indigenous people. So now, Indigenous people through 150 years through the Indian Act have really suffered not being able to be part of the conversation, the economy, and the environmental standards that we were trying to set here today. And it is through the work that we have done as Indigenous people, like the Delgamuukw court case in 1997, set the stage for consultation and accommodation. That was the real court case because the courts recognized that we had an Aboriginal right and that our duty to consult was vested in the Crown through the province and the federal government to consult with Indigenous people, to accommodate Indigenous people. And so we, since 1997, have enjoyed that accommodation and consultation. So now we've had our experience with that, and we as Indigenous people in northern British Columbia, or northwest British Columbia, in British Columbia, feel that accommodation and the duty to consult hasn't gone far enough. So we created what is called the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. The coalition began to act as a resource to Indigenous people in economic development. When we started out down that road, the Indigenous people said, we can't do any business with industry or anything unless the environment is number one on the radar, and that we are involved with the environmental standards that are going to be set. So I bring you back to the idea of the Royal Proclamation because at that time, we as Indigenous people want self-determination and self-governance, and that was the basis for moving ahead. We didn't get that, and so now, 150 years later, this is what we want, is we want to be able to have the ability to set our own standards, to be able to drive our own economy, to benefit from the economy, that our resources, our natural resources, are set within the Indigenous communities. I just have to drink of water here for a sec. In order to drive the economy, we know that in British Columbia, most of it is unceded territory. There are very few treaties there. And the Delgamuukw-Gisdewe decision was based on the idea that our land, we need to benefit from the land, and we're part of that land. And in that court case, there's a recognition that there's inescapable relationship between the economy and the land that Indigenous people should benefit from. But we never had a vehicle to get to that stage. We never had an ability to really benefit from the mining and all of the resources that were taking place on our land. Because when you have a small community that's that's been managing poverty under the Indian Act, it's very hard to manage major projects or even think about how do we get major projects developed. So Indigenous people in Northwest British Columbia came together through former Senator St. Germain, Harold Calla, and myself and others, a group of people, started to work on this idea that together Indigenous people can form an alliance and a coalition that would support economic development. So this is a fairly new organization, began in 2014. We have now 50 nations, hereditary chiefs, and band chiefs working together. And this coalition's supporting First Nations economic development. For example, in 1952, there was a Kenny Dam that was flooded in central BC. That dam flooded and dried up a river, and it also floated coffins up from the nearby community. So there's been some reconciliation work there, but the community has been trying to reestablish that stream to get the fish back into that water. And through the Major Projects Coalition, they were able to have those 4 communities now working together, and a coalition is a support vehicle facilitating the economic development. They're not the decision makers as the coalition, but helping those 4 First Nations. So what we have done as a coalition was find partners for those 4 communities, and now the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund is going to invest in those 4 communities and reestablish the waterway that was dried up by the Kenny Dam, and also seek an economic benefit. And that's a $300 million project. Those are the ways that projects can go forward, is by supporting organizations such as the Major Projects Coalition. That's the job that we want to create, is that the ability of government to support these kinds of organization, where we are 50 bands and hereditaries working together for economic and environmental purposes. The other message that the coalition members said, we can't do business without having environmental standards set. So the coalition is working towards setting their own environmental standards provincially. And so we envision having our own environmental standards provincial body that would work with the communities and the province, and then subsequently the federal government, to ensure that these projects go ahead. My own personal experience with the environmental standards that have been talked about is through the $40 billion LNG project that is going through our communities. And our experience there through the Matrilineal Coalition, the Wet'suwet'en Matrilineal Coalition, is that we had people working on the ground with the proponents. They were doing studies on the plants, the amphibians, the birds. So we had hereditary chiefs and community members working on those environmental standards. And so through that experience, we've learned that there is a way in which Indigenous people can work with economy, with the environmental standards, and still move ahead with a project. Those are the ways that we perceive moving ahead. As a coalition, we were able to provide feasibility studies for those 4 First Nations that want to reopen the Kenny Dam and to get the hydroelectric energy from it. So, and there's another opportunity here as well in BC as an example of Indigenous people working towards a greater economy, so that we don't want to be dependent on the Indian Act. We want to be able to be self-sufficient, self-sustaining, as we started out to with King George III. You know, we started out with that conversation, and we're still at that conversation where we want to be able to be self-reliant. And we've come full circle. And through the court cases, we have made some great strides. But at the end of the day, government and Indigenous people can work together. We can find a way in which to address the Bill C-69. We feel that we need to have equal playing field where we are making decisions about our lives and our future, and not somebody else making decisions for us, because that's been the norm in this country for many, many years, and we want to change the status quo. We want to be on equal footing with Canadians, and we want to be recognized, because as Indigenous people, we have a really special relationship. We have an obligation to the land, to the water, to the earth. And we grew up with that, knowing that. And we know what is out there, and we know what needs to happen on the land. One good example is the Squamish people on the LNG wood fiber project. That project would not have gone forward had the Squamish people not been involved in that project right from the beginning, where the company wanted to put hot water back into the ocean. And the Squamish people said, no, you can't do that. Find another way. So there's an example of we're able to find ways to deal with very complicated problems that come up through environmental assessments. On the Bill C-69, I think that our view is Indigenous people need to lead that conversation and to develop that policy. And government needs to support Indigenous organizations like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, like our own setting our own environmental standards through an organization, like having a governance program where we can start to uncover our relationship with Canada, because in our communities we still live in poverty, and we still manage poverty, and we live in a place that we have to recognize the internalized oppression and the internalized racism that we have experienced for the last 150 years. And so that's the work that we need to do. And we together, Canadians and Indigenous people, can unpack that and we can deliver that. But we need you to understand that we cannot be subservient and we cannot continue to operate as a problem. We're part of the solution now, because we know what's needed and we know how to get there, but we need to work with you in order to get there. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the next part of our proceedings today will be a little bit of back and forth conversation between me, Stephen, and Teresa, and in a few minutes I'll open the floor to questions. So please be thinking about your questions. I'll try and group the questions together. We'll take 2 or 3 at a time and let people on the panel speak to the particular issues in your questions that they wish to address, okay? So if I could, I'm going to start with Stephen.
Sure.
Stephen, you will know better than almost anyone in this room that not too long ago the federal government spent about $4.5 billion and bought a pipeline project.
Right.
They say they're going to get that pipeline built. Now, let's say that happens.
Right.
Do you want to buy that pipeline?
Absolutely. You know, and once I see a pig fly across the sky, we'll see. But
Well, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Can you do it?
Yeah.
Can you really buy this pipeline?
you know, we need to have that discussion. And you know, we've tried. You know, we've tried to go through the top levels, tried to meet with the Minister of Finance, tried to meet with the Minister of Natural Resources Canada. And this always seems to be some barriers to at least discuss it. You know, there's many models. You know, my colleague and I, Larry, we've gone to Toronto and met with a merging companies. And we asked them, give us some examples of how this would look. You know, at the end of the day, can we get the money? He goes, absolutely. You go down this street called Bay Street, they have money. They want to see this project go through. And the fact of that we have oil and gas producing First Nations, they have product to move too. and the economic opportunity, because it goes through our traditional territories, you know, and I hate bringing up the court cases, you know, our title has been identified. You know, the Supreme Court has made a ruling that there's Indigenous title. Okay, let's get past that. Now let's talk business. You know, there's many First Nations in Canada that are struggling. You look at what's happening, some of our communities are just engulfed by cities, i.e. the coastal tribes that are opposing the TMX. I look at my brother Tom Dustyhorn. I call him my brother because we both went to Notre Dame in Saskatchewan, graduated from the school there. Now he's the leader of his community called the Quakatus, and in Cree that means like poor man. And literally, they have no economic development opportunities other than a possible equity play in the potash mine, which the government isn't too keen on bringing into communities. So he asks me, if this pipeline goes through, how do we get a part of it? You got to understand, a lot of communities have no capital. Now, of course, and they care about the environment as well. So if it's my pipe dream and it's something that I see, yeah, we First Nations own it, the communities own it, and we see 643 dividends distributed across this country. That's the goal I would love to see.
So you don't want it to be a pipe dream, you want it to be a pipeline dream.
Yeah, pipeline dream. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, Teresa, it seems to me that the organization you represent, the Major Projects Coalition, is in part a response to the kind of problem that Stephen's
Yes,
talking about. How
exactly.
can First Nations, these often rather small communities, you know, a few hundred, 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 people, how can they participate in multi-billion-dollar projects that are enormously complex?
Yes. Absolutely.
How's that going to happen?
Well, we've had that experience already. We had a chance to buy into the Pacific Trails pipeline as 16 Indigenous communities in British Columbia. We couldn't get the financing. We could have gone to the bank and got a loan for 11%. That wouldn't have made any money for us. But we realized that Canada had a loan guarantee fund of $20 billion that was available to banks and to Bombardier or to other places, CMHC. So we started to lobby government to look at how can we access a loan guarantee at a very low rate with that Pacific Trails pipeline. Had we been able to borrow $3 billion, we would have made $6 billion on that project. That would have been divided by the 16 communities that were along that pipeline. That would have alleviated some of the social pressures and the pressures of government having to support those communities as well. So it's really about working with government so that we, and senators and government, so that we can get a loan guarantee for the next project that's coming up. And for Trans Mountain, yes, we did hear from Chief Alan Adams. He said, we choked that pipeline out as Indigenous people across the country because we want to own it. And we want to be able to set the standards, the environmental standards as we go forward, and to set the economy for our people. So we have a lot to say about the Trans Mountain, and as we go forward, it's important to realize, as what I said earlier, is that Indigenous people have to be part of the solution on the ground, setting their own environmental standards, provincially setting their standards so that those two work together, and in turn work with the federal government. Those things have to be part and parcel. They cannot be separate from the economy. So that's where we're going with it, and those things need to happen. We need to have a loan guarantee for those major projects that are coming down the pike, and we need to be able to find the partnerships with government and industry as we move forward.
And can both of you talk more, if you feel that it's appropriate, talk more about the challenges of getting First Nations to work together? You've talked about the collaboration that has to take place between First Nations or Indigenous people, industry, and government. But what about within your communities? There's some challenges there.
There are, definitely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, but why don't you start?
So, as an example, in our community of the Wet'suwet'en, we have 5 bands, and we have hereditary chiefs and bands. Historically, the hereditary chiefs, the owners of the land, the users of the land, have never been part of the conversation, have never been recognized as having any status except for the Delgamuukw decision. There's some animosity there. There is also because of the fact that reserves are a little postcard size, and they only manage themselves through the Indian Act. And so that has been a real detriment to the communities and to the people, because what has happened over the last 150 years is the internalized oppression that people feel of not being able to set their own canoe down the river and to get an economic benefit from the lands and resources that are actually being used today from everyone else except our own people. So now we're saying we have to be able to use those resources and to be able to share those resources with the rest of Canada, because it can't work without us working together. And that's why the coalition was formed, because of together we can do a lot. And that just doesn't mean as Indian people. Together, as Canadian society and Indigenous people working together, we can do a lot of good things. But you have to open your ears, you have to listen, and you have to take the lead of Indigenous people in setting environmental standards and moving towards a greater economy for this country.
Stephen, how about you on this issue of Indigenous communities working together?
Yeah, we talk about, I mentioned consultation in the past, where consultation has to be meaningful with the government and industry. But as we discovered now, especially with this pipeline being in the forefront, we didn't consult with each other. Like I said, I represent 130 First Nations that have oil and gas and potential to produce oil and gas. And, our communities subsidize the lack of funding. So they tackle the infrastructure, they tackle the social problems with any money that they can find. Housing is a big issue, of course. And, I don't need to tell you, if you don't know, then welcome to Canada. But, we need to work together and start talking more about economic development initiatives, and then this being part of it. I know Energy East, we might not call it that, will probably surface again. The government's investment into the infrastructure in Canada is going to come to the forefront again. And why we're shipping oil to the coast and the east, why can't they take our oil that we produce in Alberta? Well, it's dirty oil. There's a lot of things that are in front of us, social issues. The social media is one of the worst things. And, I can appreciate Dr. David Suzuki for some of the things he says. But when it hurts our economic development, I have a problem when he puts on a headdress.
Can I just say one more thing about that is the work on Indigenous governance needs to happen at the community level. Because we've been operating under a band council system. When we have two systems in place, the hereditary and the band councils, those two need to reconcile. And they need to be supported in order to develop a governance model for decision-making on major projects at the community level. And at the provincial level and federal level, there needs to be a way for Indigenous people to realize what it's going to take to come out of colonization, to decolonize our people into who we really are as Indigenous people. We can live side by side like the two-row wampum belt that was of the first treaty in this province. We can live side by side, and it's recognizing that we can and we can do that and finding ways to do that. And government has a responsibility to help make that happen, because for too long it's been an inequity.
If I can just also add, as mentioned in what I spoke about earlier, is that our systems were taken away. And all of a sudden, the system that you're accustomed to, the government of Canada and its policies, for some reason, we have to have a chief and we have to have a council and we have to govern ourselves the way, when in the past, that wasn't the way it was. Like I listen to our elders when they speak about treaty and they speak about things, how they were done long ago. For example, the hereditary chief is not recognized. And that's a system that they've had before colonization, and it worked for them. And that's kind of how it should have been. So for us to adopt the policies and the way that the non-Indigenous do things today, that was our going backwards. So now we're educating, but we're building that back. We're taking what we can, the successes, and then we're moving forward together. But we need government's help. We need the influence. How things and you treat people and how I'll say it, non-Indigenous look at us like, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't raise that money, you can't operate a pipeline. How do you know? Try us. Like a lot of us are educated, a lot of us are lawyers. You'll be surprised how many engineers we have. It's simple as this, Brian. If I punch you in your nose, you're going to bleed red. And if you punch me in the nose, I'm going to bleed red. It's just humanity. We're mankind. And we got to be able to work together. Our friends that come and that come from different countries and work for Canada, they have to understand we're working together. It's crazy. The Department of Indian Affairs, you see so many changes in who we have to talk to. And it seems like we're going like this every time we come to Ottawa. And it shouldn't be that way. We got to be able to work together. One of the things, back home in Alberta, we're going to be having a provincial election. And one of the probable candidates for the premier, he has openly said in the public engagements that I've seen him at, is that resource revenue sharing is a must. It has to happen. We're in the same province. We ain't going anywhere. You're not going to go back to England or Germany or wherever your forefathers came from. But at the end of the day, we can enjoy this and do this work together. So that's why consultation within our own communities needs to happen. We're going to have an AFN meeting here next week in Ottawa. What are they going to get done? I don't know. But I'm scared to hell that this Bill C-69 is going to be put on the floor and pushed through in its current form. It needs some amendment, and that's the consultation we need to do.
Oh, sorry. Carry on.
Yeah, just one more point. If my job, my capacity is to help educate and inform the leaders of this bill. The problem with how our communities and our leaders are seen as is the chief is the only one that government and industry will talk to. And to me, that's a little disrespectful, because on the backside of it, He's got to deal with the social problems. He's got to deal with high schools. He's got to deal with, you know, everything under the sun in his own community. So for me to bring him aside and say, hey, you know what, this issue on Bill C-69, it can't happen yet. We got to fix it. Yeah. And he goes back to his fire that he's dealing with in his community. So, you know, those are things we have to continue to change and move forward. So going back to our traditional forms of government, I think, is probably one way to do it.
So Bill C-69, we're going to come back to that in a second because it's terribly important and it's current, and we have a senator with us who's going to be considering it in his role as a legislator in the next few days. But just before we get to that, Stephen, you said something that I don't want to sort of let disappear without digging into it for a second. You said, I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth, you said, well, Energy East, you know, it may come back again under a different name, or something to that effect. Because one of the questions I was going to ask you was, you know, okay, we've talked a little bit about Trans Mountain, but, you know, what are the other projects on the horizon? So that Aboriginal people or Indigenous people might take a role or a position. Are you saying that there's a conversation going on in the Indigenous world about other pipelines?
Well, you know, I know a lot of the our so-called environmentalists, they acknowledge and they kind of take a piece of information and run with it. That's why I don't really appreciate my friend Dr. Suzuki, because, you know, he sets a fire and it just takes off. And with social media and how things are, you know, it influences our younger people. So right now, at my kitchen table, I have a conversation with my daughter to tell her that pipelines are the safest way to move this product. Case in point, you know, I don't like getting into that as far as, you know, debating what is safe or what isn't safe. But, you know, if you do your research and you kind of understand it's safe there. But the Energy East, definitely I can see it coming back. You know, it might be called something else. And you know, we have to position ourselves. You know, and right now, from what I know culturally, you know, when you go into the Manitoba area from Alberta, there's prophecies in different of those tribes, i.e. the Sioux tribe. There's a prophecy there, and you know, it really conflicts with this development. But you know, we have to be prepared, because right now a lot of the problems in Manitoba, there is not too much economic development. I know a lot of communities you see them in the news all the time. You know, the inadequate housing, no lack of clean water. You know, there's things that I've come across culturally, and I'll share it with you. If you're a believer in God, you'll appreciate this. We have our cultures and traditions, and in 2016, I held this pipeline gridlock conference in Calgary, and I was getting beat up by environmentalists. I had elders phoning me. I was being told I'm killing the earth. So I took it into one of my ceremonies, and I asked the question. I said, God, are these pipelines good for our people? And in the ceremony, I was told, after translation, is that these pipelines are going to move water. Maybe not in our lifetime, but you're going to see them move water. So one of the things I'm really good at is surfing TV and being a couch potato. And one of the things I discovered was on the Discovery Channel is that they're actually doing this in Australia, where they're taking water from the ocean. It's coming to a facility. They're taking out the salt, and it's helping Melbourne. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no potable water. It's all aquifers are dry, so they need water for that huge city and infrastructure. So they're bringing it in that way. So that's kind of the things that I see. But you know, going forward though, like our communities want to be. If there's a pipeline going through the province and our territories, it's in their best interest to at least have a part of it. And you know, I'll say this until I told the presidents of CAP and SEPA, the Pipeline Association and the petroleum producers, our regulations in both pipeline and oil and gas are world class. Our standards are high. To drill oil in Canada costs money to be safe. And the same thing with the pipelines. The pipeline monitoring that Canada is doing is world class. So I hope to get a check from them for saying that. But you know, it's our job to help give that message. So
Well, I'm so glad that you've invoked the name of David Suzuki, because I am eternally grateful to David Suzuki. He helped me to understand myself better. He explained that the economic way of thinking is a form of mental illness. And I always wondered what was wrong with me. And he made it clearer to me. We talked, sorry, Teresa, did you want to speak
I just wanted to
further on this
further
point?
comment on
Yes,
Stephen's
before we
point
get to
there.
C69, yeah.
Is that Indigenous people at that conference you were talking about said to Enbridge, you have had these pipelines in the ground too long. Something's going to happen. Change it. Take them out and replace them because they're eroding. That's another job. So if you listen, we've got some answers to do some things.
Great, thank you. So let's talk for a minute about C69, and after that I'll open the floor for questions. So please be ready with your questions for our panelists. You know, we've talked a lot about how Indigenous people, governments, and industry have to work together. And so governments are a key piece of this puzzle. And one of the things that governments do is they set, obviously, the regulatory and the legal framework within which decisions are made about investment and carrying out of these projects. So it's in that context that we've got this bill C69. C69 is, you know, the government's attempt to update the legal regulatory framework within which many of these major projects will take place. I've heard, I think, that you have some reservations about the legislation. Can we talk about that for a minute? Would you be able to help us understand some of the concerns that you have? Stephen,
Sure.
Would you like to go first?
Sure. First of all, I was saying earlier, the environmental devastation I created by just printing off the bill. You know, the stack of paper was that much. You know, it's very, very, obviously, I think you got to be a lawyer to read it, and it's, but from what, engaging with some of our industry partners and talking to other Indigenous leaders, one of the biggest problems is that, you know, it's going to handcuff our forward progression in economic development. You know, there's a lot of legislation. There's now different approvals that you need to get passed. And seeking pre-approval is something that you're not allowed to do. So as far as you tie that to our Indigenous right, our treaty right, and what we stand for on the land, it's going to really hold a lot of our progression back. So someone else, like another layer of bureaucracy, is going to decide if a project should go through or not. And to even talk about it prior to, is going to be considered illegal, and that's something that I know that isn't being shared with our chiefs. The other part is that, you know, other outside forces or outside people can kind of interfere. And like right now, in the past, you've seen a chief from Kanesatake in Quebec comment about the oil sands in Alberta. And now, under this legislation, that chief there can stop what's happening in Alberta. And, you know, again, part of our duty to consult with each other is now amplified even further. Because now he's taken out, because he's standing up and he wants to protect the earth, and so do we, no doubt about it. But he's going to get in the way of economic development, you know, and to me, that's not the right way to do it. So a lot of things need to be amended. And trust me when I say this, we agree with majority of the environmental concerns in that bill. Like, we all drink water and we're all paying for it now. You know, we have to pay for water. You know, it's crazy. When I was little, I'd be having water fights with my cousins, and my grandfather would tell me, you know, one of these days, don't disrespect the water, you're going to be paying for it. And look at where we're at today. It's unbelievable. But things like that need to be changed. And what we have at the Indian Resource Council is through an MOU, we're at the table with Indian Oil and Gas Canada on modernizing the regulations that when oil production is on our land. And that's the approach that Canada needs to take in. Not our chiefs, but our technicians, our technical people. Maybe it's a lawyer, but someone who understands, our Indigenous rights in business, because we have to have that balance, and that's the key word here is balance. We do so much to the environment, and for some reason, oil and gas and pipelines in Canada is being picked on. Like, go see a Diavik mine. My friend used to work in one. 22 kilometers, he has to take a little trail to get into the ground. Go see the gold mining they do in the Yukon. It's unbelievable. The raw sewage being dumped in Victoria, the raw sewage being dumped in the St. Lawrence. I don't know how fish taste after it swims through that stuff, but there's lots of stuff happening to the environment. It's not just oil and gas, but I'll say that our regulations are there. So with this bill, before it passes, we need some amendments, further amendments to ensure that it's more balanced. Because right now, I feel that it's tilted to one side.
Great.
Yeah.
Teresa, just briefly, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Sure. So yes, there is an imbalance, totally, because again, we're not in the driver's seat as Indigenous people. We know what the environmental issues are at the very grassroots level. And so we need to play a huge role in the development of environmental standards. So right now, the federal government and the province are developing, revitalizing the environmental process. They've consulted with us, they've asked us questions. But when you talk to somebody, you don't know whether that information is getting in there and whether it's going to go anywhere. That's why we say that we know what the problems are at the community level. And so we need to set our own environmental standards as Indigenous people, and we need to operate that provincially and federally. We need to work together on it. And we need to find a way to work together on that in order to make it work. Our experiences have been that when it's those programs such as the Major Projects Coalition, when they're driven by Indigenous people, they work and there's success there. So that's been our experience, and we want to share that success because if we don't do that, then we're subjected to more protests and stoppages and all of that stuff that goes along with it, and we don't want that. We want to be able to be part of the economy and part of the environmental framework.
Great, thank you. All right, so I may only have time for one round of questions. I'm sorry, it's entirely my fault. I've just been enjoying the conversation so much, I probably let it go on maybe a little too long. I'll take 3 questions now, and if we have time, we'll come back for another one. I see we have Elder Joe, the lady in the back, and this gentleman here. So let's start here. We have a microphone if you don't mind.
I don't know if any of you remember the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline development, the inquiry. I was able to act as counsel, although I'm a nurse, for the Northwest Territories Mental Health Association, because our concern, and we were a group, grassroots, made up of anyone who really wanted to join us, and they didn't have to have mental health problems, but it was made up of hairdressers and taxi drivers and the frontline people who wanted to express their concern about rapid industrialization and how would that affect the people. And we were very concerned about that. We didn't go into, oh no, don't build the pipeline, or oh yes, build the pipeline. We were saying, what will happen to the people with this rapid industrialization? And we need to have things in place, a structure in place, so that they can receive the help that they need in order to adjust, so that they aren't destroyed by this rapid industrialization and the influx of workers. So Berger had asked me to travel with them during the fourth phase, and I felt that I didn't have to because I attended the hearings in Yellowknife, but we had members of our organization in all of the communities up and down the Mackenzie Delta, and they could speak for themselves. Recently, and so they did, and they expressed their concerns to Berger, and particularly Frank Tiselli, who was the chief of Fort Good Hope at the time, made a statement that really I was surprised about, because I was making supper one night and I was listening to the news, and Chief Frank was saying that he would die before he would let the pipeline go through. And I thought, what? You can't say that. So I called him up the next day and I said, I heard your speech and it was very good, but it was kind of over the top. But he said, these are my feelings and the feelings of the community, that we are not in a position right now to deal with it, and we're concerned about each other, and we need the infrastructure of social services and health to be able to survive. And it made sense. It also made very good sense to Mr. Justice Berger, and he used to tell me, like, I was sitting there with a bunch of lawyers and pipeline people, and I knew what I was talking about, and expressing the concerns of the people, but I was really intimidated by the whole process. And Mr. Berger used to tell me every day, oh, you're doing a fine job, you're helping me write my report. And I thought, yeah, it's very kind of you to encourage me, but I doubt it. But what happened when the report came out was that he took into consideration all of our recommendations, that we had to focus on the people, and the camps had to be away from the communities for the good of the workers and also the communities. We didn't want people to have meaningless jobs, because the companies were saying, oh yeah, we'll hire Indigenous people, but they didn't know how to work a pipeline, and there weren't any training ideas in place. And they also, and our concern was that they might have a job with the pipeline, but they might be just standing with a sign that says stop and go, and that would be, they might be well paid, but it wasn't fulfilling, I guess. So I'd like to, I don't want to take up too much time, but I don't know if any of you know Whit Fraser. He was a reporter with the CBC in the Northwest Territories, and he's written a book recently about, he covered the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, and he speaks at length about his experiences in covering the inquiry during that time. And the title of the book is True North Rising, and it might be something that you might want to pick up. And also read the Phase 4 of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, if you can get a hold of it. I don't know if they're still printing it, but it would serve you well to have that information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Not at all. I think young lady over here, please. Yes. You should come here more often.
Yes. Hi, my name is Rosa Galvez, and I'm senator with my colleague Christmas. And I'm also the president of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee, where probably, logically, C69 will come to our committee. I am so happy to hear that First Nations wants to be part of the economical development of our great country of Canada. However, I would like to know what is this type of economical development that you want to participate, and what is the the impacts on the environment that you are willing to accept that is coming with this economical development. I also want to mention that, you know, in the north, there is a lot of climate change, and you are affected a lot more than what we are being affected, and we know we are being affected a lot. So I would like to hear from you, what is the type of economical development that you are ready to have, and what is the impact, environmental impact, that you will accept for this development?
Lovely. Thank you, Senator. And one more question here. This gentleman. Lovely.
Thank you. I'm Philip Schubert. I'm a consultant to developing countries on energy. I have questions for Teresa and Stephen. The decision by the federal court that blocked the Trans Mountain pipeline, in your opinions, was it truly justified in terms of the deficient process and the duty to consult? And do you see a process, given this bill that's hovering, that can take place and allow that project to go ahead in a timely fashion, given that the oil industry in the west, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, is coming unstuck with $17 a barrel and probably going down from there. And so that's a quick first one for Teresa. I think you said that the LNG Canada consultations actually were well done. Were the Northern Gateway consultations adequately done before the federal government stopped that project? And then finally for Stephen, do you see a chance to put together a business deal where you can get our $4.5 billion back to the federal government, and so it's not out of our pockets? That would be great if you can do it.
Great, thank you. So please pick and choose whatever you want to respond to from those three questions. Stephen, would you like to start?
You know, the concessions with the environmental concerns, and you talk about global warming, I'm not a scientist, but, at the end of the day, there's got to be give and take. So, for example, this pipeline, and what it does, if you ever seen one put in the ground, the environmental disruption that happens, and currently right now in my community, being in Pigeon Lake with the Bonnie Glenfield, there's pipes that aren't being used that we're asking to be taken out so we can continue further development. There's a lot of, we can argue all day and we can debate all day. What's just safer? In my view, from the research I've done, it's safer to have the pipeline. Otherwise you have these big diesel engine trains, and trains derail, by the way. Oh, and not only that, trains are along our rivers and along our lakes, and if they derailment, so you talk about accidents like that. And then there's an incident in Quebec where trains got in a little bit of an accident, and unfortunately, some of people went to meet the maker. We can decide that all day. So when you talk about the business and economic and environment, that's the balance I'm talking about. Is that okay? Canada needs to continue to move forward, and so do we, because we're benefits from it, indirectly, in the past, but now we want a bigger take. So when we talk about the pipeline and owning it, absolutely, it's a big initiative, it's a big dream, but it's to find the model that works, because our lands on reserve have no value. Under the banking standards of investment, there's no value in our land unless you create your own governance to make it attractive. And wherever there's we call it a certificate of possession, and now that land is bankable. But even still yet, it's not given the proper monetary value. So a lot of communities need that capital. So this investment of Suncor and Mikisew Cree and Fort McKay is something that works. They ended up just signing for a lot of debt right now. But, in the long run, they're going to see some huge benefits. And that's what my brother Tom from Poor Man's Coacatus is prepared to do for his people. He has government debt. He says over $9 million of government debt, where that money came in from the federal government. And because of their population, because of their needs, eventually they spent more than what they can receive from the government. So now, under the social eyes of Canada, Coacatoose is a bad place because they don't know how to manage money, which is not true. Because they have housing issues, they have water issues, they got a population of millennials that need to go to university. You know, stuff that's been negotiated in the treaty. So it all ties together. So for them to participate in a big model like this, there's ways to do that. And we're prepared to do what we can. If someone has anybody's phone number to Sohan or to our Minister of Natural Resources or to the Minister of Finance, I'm here till 4 o'clock.
Teresa?
Yes, I think there is a way to do business. Our good example has been through LNG. With the people actually working in the environment, setting their own environmental standards at the community level, working with the proponent, you have a better chance of the project going through. But that's not good enough because that's only one project. And so what we need to do is set our own environmental standards as Indigenous people provincially, so that it can flow down to the community. So there's an intersection there that would help projects go forward. So that's a really important piece. And the other piece, the really good example is right now through the Major Projects Coalition, we're able to possibly buy into a transmission line that would support that LNG project. And that would be supported by the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. So there's working relationships that can happen, but again, our people need to be part of that conversation of setting the environmental standards at the very local level. So with that, Trans Mountain, had the Indigenous people been a part of that conversation, like, for example, the wood fiber LNG project for the Squamish Nation, that project was a good example of working with the government and industry to setting environmental standards so that you didn't heat up the water. You know, you didn't pump hot water back into an ocean because the fish can't live in hot water. So that's a very good example of how things can be done. And through the Major Projects Coalition, when we're all working together, things can happen in a very efficient way. Because one community cannot take on a major project alone. To do the feasibility studies, to do the what it takes to the economics of a project. So it's just, you know, they don't have the money or the resources or the time to do that. So that's why the Major Projects Coalition is a vehicle that supports that and facilitates that discussion and finds that partnership. So the next thing we need to do is to support for any further major projects, the ability to buy that project through a loan guarantee. And I think we are lobbying diligently with the senators and government so that when the next projects come along, like the Energy East or West or wherever it's going to go, that we'll be able to buy that project as Indigenous people. You know, so that's what we need is a loan guarantee and are setting our own environmental standards and organizations that has to deal with, because as I mentioned, the communities are broken from 150 years of oppression. And so part of that conversation needs to be to develop a governance programs so that we can bring people back into the conversation of how do you actually manage your lands effectively. And
I noticed that Stephen was very careful not to say that he would pay $4.5 billion for the pipeline. And I think he was quite right to do so. He's, you know, I mean, the first thing you learn when you're in negotiation is when the other party says, well, how much do you think what I'm offering is worth? The answer has to be not much, right? Senator Christmas, I'm sorry we've run out of time for other questions, although I hope we'll be able to stay around and continue some discussions informally. But Senator Christmas has very kindly offered to give us some of his thoughts on what he's heard in the discussion this morning. I'm going to ask him to join us. Senator Christmas has served in various leadership positions in the Mi'kmaq Nation of Nova Scotia and the community of Membertou. And by the way, I hope he'll take a moment to tell you about the remarkable success of economic development that the community of Membertou represents. He and Burnt Christmas are probably the two people most responsible for the tremendous success of that community. He's the former director of the Union of Nova Scotia Indians. He was actively involved in the recognition and implementation of Mi'kmaq Aboriginal and treaty rights in Nova Scotia. And in December 2016, in other words, 2 years ago, he became Canada's first Mi'kmaq senator. Senator.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Brian. I was actually sworn in the same day as Senator Galvez. It's December 14th. I remember clearly that day. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for doing this. Really appreciate you hosting this very important event. And thank you very much for coming out this morning and listening to this, I think, a very interesting debate. I hope more than anything, it helps change Canadians' perceptions about how Indigenous people are transforming Canada. So you've heard about the 130 First Nations that Mr. Buffalo currently represents in the oil and gas industry and also other energy sectors, and how his group is beginning to transform how Indigenous people participate in the Canadian economy. And as you can tell from his comments, that they're not done, that more transformation is possible. And I'm also so excited about Ms. Tate Day and her 50 First Nations who are raising private capital to fund major projects in Canada, like the Kenny Dam. And that is only the start. So, and I also have to say a quick word. I know Sean Willey has gone, but Sean represents a development corporation, Dayneti, and he is among numerous, hundreds of Indigenous-led development corporations, including the Membertou Development Corporation that I was once a part of, that are also transforming economies across vast regions in Canada. So the discussion I would love to have started from here is that Indigenous people are going to make a difference in the economy of Canada. And with that, they are also bringing a sense of responsibility about the environment that is inherent in Indigenous ways of thinking and believing. So we are bringing something different to the table that I think that is not there. So we believe, and I certainly believe, that by, I'm tempted to say allowing, but that's not the proper word. I believe that Indigenous economies will emerge in Canada as a transformational agent. And I certainly believe that by working with Indigenous peoples, organizations, companies, businesses, development corporations, they are going to become, I would say, in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, a major part of Canada's emerging economy. And leaders such as Ms. Tate Day and Mr. Willey and also Mr. Buffalo are some of those speakers, some of those leaders that are beginning to lead that transformation. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing a new vision of Canada that has Indigenous people as its partner. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't possibly improve on those concluding remarks. So all I will say is thank you again for attending this event of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the leading public policy think tank in Ottawa. We're always delighted to welcome you to our home. Our offices are upstairs. And we look forward to seeing you again at another of our events where we hope to be discussing another vital public policy issue facing Canada. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.